To see everybody turn out, I can tell we are a church that likes to understand the Bible, and it's exciting to me I haven't ever done it exactly this way in terms of trying to go through the whole Bible in this particular format. I've taught Disciple Bible Study multiple times, which is sort of a Bible survey. I've discovered that a lot of people, even though they like to take Disciple, because of the homework aspect, and they are excited but not able to commit to that. And so this will have some similarity. Some of you have been through Disciple 1, but it'll be a little different. And I'm not going to make you do any homework, although obviously, I encourage everybody to read the Bible every day. And, if you'd like to be reading in the same places where we are going to be journeying, that would be good. But you notice, if you do have this, or look on to somebody next to you, if I'm sorry I didn't make enough, I'm overjoyed that I underestimated, because it means we have even more than I anticipated. You can see that there are 66 books in the Bible. That means some weeks we'll cover more than one book, and you'll see, obviously, it'll be what I call a survey course, not an in-depth course. But I hope, my goal is that by the end, you can get a sense of how the Bible flows from beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation, or as I heard a preacher one time say, from Genesis to maps.
I'll go around.
I don't think you can get in the other side.
Thank you.
They want you to sit next to your sweetheart. There you go. It's all right. It's all right.
I didn't need somebody to keep me in focus.
To poke you. So each week, most weeks, you can see we will cover one or two books of the Bible as an overview of what's it about. How does it fit into the overall flow of the whole Bible? When was it written? What's it addressing? What's the focus of the book? And we'll read selected pieces as we go along. But you'll notice that I'm starting tonight. There's a couple of books that I'm actually going to break into 2 weeks. Genesis is one of them. Acts is another one that I'm actually breaking into 2 weeks. And that's because these two books are so chock full of important things that I just am going to take the time and look at the natural break. So let me start with prayer, and we'll begin. Lord, we're grateful on this night to begin a new season of study and time to reflect on your word, and time to make new relationships, and ask that you'd really bless this time and bless us as we encounter your word, and that you would speak to us through the power of your Holy Spirit. And this we pray in your name. Amen. Amen. Also allow a little extra time, and it's kind of a lot of things converging. This Sunday, my sermon is going to sort of be on how to read the Bible and a little bit more about the Bible. This Sunday we'll be giving our third graders their Bibles. So I'm really focusing on the Bible. And some of you have done a lot of Bible studies. Some of you probably haven't done as many. I've mentioned, I think, in sermons before that when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, I decided I was a little different as a kid. I was really interested in the Bible and in church and Sunday school, and maybe that was a sign of things to come. And I decided, I'd gotten my 3rd grade Bible, and I decided every night to just read it. Started with Genesis, and I just kept reading until I got to about Leviticus and Numbers. And then, you start to really, especially for a 3rd or 4th grader, you get thinking, this is, but I kept trudging onward, and some of the things, of course, didn't make a lot of sense, and a few of the things even worried me. It said, we're not supposed to eat shellfish, and some other things, or pork, and we had pork chops last night, and, I didn't have any context to put that into. And my parents, God love them, had never really been to any Bible studies. They weren't able to answer really many of my questions. And sometimes we grow up, and a lot of the books of the Bible are still mysterious. We know sort of the most worn passages. We know the ones that get preached on all the time. We know about the prodigal son. We know the Gospels and the Christmas stories and the Exodus stories and other ones that have been made into movies. But we may not understand the total flow. And as I say to kids and say to anybody, the Bible, and the word Bible just means book. You know, that's all. The word Bible just means book. In the back of a report, you have a bibliography. You know, it says the word Bible just means book, and that's the list of the books. In French, a library is a bibliothèque. So the word Bible just means book, and often, at least older Bibles, say Holy Bible. And of course, the word holy really just, actually, literally, the word holy means set apart. It means usually retaining to God, setting something apart. So the Bible is God's book. It is a holy book, but of course it is actually 66 books. 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament. The Bible is its own library of 66 books. And that's part of why, you know, when you say, well, I'm just going to read it cover to cover, there are some challenges with that. And one of the big challenges is it's a book of 66 books, but there are different kinds of books. And we know that. The Bible is full of different kinds of books. Right in the middle of the Bible is the book of Psalms. And the word psalm means psalm. It's a songbook. It's a hymnal. And so when we're reading Psalms, we are reading lyrics to songs. And when you're reading lyrics to songs, that's one kind of literature. And really, songs are meant to be sung, not so much read, although reading the Psalms is a blessing. But you have to understand, where do these come from? Well, they were meant to be sung by a group. The Psalms, we'll get to them, you know, here in a while. But it'll tell you even what the occasion is for that song to be sung. It'll say a song of ascents. You know, A-S-C-E-N-T-S. That means ascending up to the hill of Zion as the people are walking to the temple to make their sacrifices. This is a song you would be singing as you're walking up the hill. And so that's a songbook. Well, a songbook is very different from a law book, which is what Leviticus is. Leviticus is a law book. And my father was an attorney. And, you know, if you've ever tried to read a law book, it's not, you know, if you need something to put you to sleep, that's a good thing, is, you know, a law book. Case law, and, you know, so a law book and a songbook are very different kinds of literature. Paul's letters are letters. Some of them personal letters, some of them letters to whole congregations. Books like 1st and 2nd Samuel are history books. You know, Proverbs is a book of wise sayings. Revelation is a whole unique animal of itself that has some similarities to books like Daniel, but really is its own interesting kind of literature, apocalyptic literature. And that's not even all. So the books of the Bible have different kinds of literature. And sometimes within one book, it'll switch the kind of literature it is. Some of this gets masked by the fact that we're reading a translation. You know, if we were reading these in the original languages, sometimes the kind of literature would be a little more obvious. Sometimes things like music and wise sayings and clever sayings lose a lot in translation. Humor uses a lot in translation. And so we're always having to remember what we're reading is a translation of the original Hebrew when it comes to the Old Testament and the original Greek when it comes to the New Testament. And when I began to study the Bible in an academic way, especially when I got to seminary and began to understand a little bit more about the original languages and the kinds of literature and how the Jewish people understood their Bible, their Old Testament, a lot of things start to make more sense. And so that's some of the things we'll talk about as we go through this. We'll talk about what kind of literature is this and how, where did it come from? But let's start with Genesis, and we'll talk more about general biblical knowledge as we go along. But let's start with Genesis. And tonight, we're going to talk about the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which, just to get even a taste of the first 11 chapters, is a lot. The one good thing is these are stories that you know. At least you think you know, because you've heard them a lot. They're some of the earliest stories we read as kids. And the first 11 chapters of Genesis are different from the rest of the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis, when you get to chapter 12, focuses on one man and his family. You get to chapter 12, we'll talk about it next week. Get to chapter 12 and we talk about Abraham. And we follow Abraham's family. From chapter 12 all the way to the end of Genesis, we follow Abraham and his wife Sarah, and their children and their grandchildren and their descendants and all that is a part of that family saga. And we can date Abraham to somewhere around 2000 BC. Some scholars would put Abraham a little later, more like 1750 BC. But somewhere 1750 BC, between that and say 2000 BC, we would plug Abraham. But the 11 chapters that precede Genesis chapter 12, the 11 chapters that precede the story of Abraham, we usually refer to as prehistory. We can't put a date on it. And even more so, and I've said this before, and I've said it more briefly in sermons, when you read the book of Genesis 1 through 11, you realize that these stories, and we talk about the Genesis stories, you can come on in. You can come on in. When you read the Genesis stories, which center around creation, the stories in Eden, Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, the stories that relate to the flood, the stories that relate to the Tower of Babel, these stories are of a different kind of literature. And for us, probably the best way to think about them is to think about them the same way we think about Jesus' parables. Now some people, let's be honest, some people in what I would think of as very conservative churches, and everybody in this room probably grew up in a different kind of church. Not everybody here grew up United Methodist, and even if you did, one United Methodist church to the next can be very different. But there are people that are of a more fundamentalist nature that read Genesis 1 through 11 as scientific history. That this is a scientific account of the beginnings of the universe and the beginnings of planet Earth. And those folks who take Genesis 1 through 11 as scientific history run into some challenges. For one, there was a bishop back in, I believe in the 1800s, who took all the genealogies, starting with Adam, and added up how old they were supposed to be, and spent a lot of time saying, well, if Adam lived to be this age, and he had a child at this age, and the average lifespan, and even though they lived a long time, and anyway, he added it all up, and he dated creation. And he came up with creation being in the year 4004 BC. Based on genealogy. He came up with creation happening 4004 BC, which, in other words, 6,000 years ago. Well, if you take this book with that kind of scientific literalism, then you are forced to then believe that the entire universe is only 6,000 years old. Well, if you've ever gone to any kind of science class, that causes lots of problems to have a belief that the universe is only 6,000 years old. Because, scientists tell us how quick light travels. Light travels 186,000 miles per second. And we're seeing light from distant stars that is millions of years ago. The light that we see traveling from other galaxies, that light left those stars millions of years ago. Geologists tell us that the Earth is, of course, several million years old. And if you take these stories as meant to be scientific, historical literalism, and you say, well, I believe the Earth and the whole universe is only 6,000 years old, you are having to choose between the Bible and science. You're having to either say one is true and the other is false. And there are people who say science is wrong about everything. There are people who dispute everything about science. And I happened into a Christian bookstore one time, and Janine was looking at whatever Janine was looking at, and I think she was looking at children's stuff in the Christian bookstore. And you know, there are a lot of people who homeschool their kids and who are very conservative, fundamentalist. And there were some textbooks there geared at that sort of fundamentalist approach. And I just happened to be curious. I picked up a science book from this sort of fundamentalist background. And I just happened to open a page, and this was not a joke, this was real. There's a picture of people with dinosaurs in the background. Because if the Earth is only 6,000 years old, well, humans and dinosaurs were around at the same time. And I mean, it was like the Flintstones. I mean, it was, and again, you know, not those are, a lot of those folks are good, fine folk, but I believe the error there of folks who try to take these first 11 chapters of Genesis and say this is a scientific account of the origins of the universe. They are having to say, well, therefore we totally disbelieve all science, and science is a tool of the devil and meant to fool us. That science versus faith, or science versus religion, is only present if we try to take these 11 chapters of Genesis as a scientific textbook, as a scientific account of the origins of the universe. But if you understand Hebrew literature, and as I said, the Bible is full of lots of different kinds of literature. There are parts of the Bible that are historical narratives. When we get into 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and other places, these are historical narratives about this king fought this king on this battlefield in this place. And, I mean, you know, they are very specific historical narratives. But the literature that we find in Genesis 1 through 11 don't read like that. They read very differently. They read much more like, as I say, parable is probably the closest kind of literature that they would be like. And if we take them that way, if we understand them as a parable about human nature and the human condition, we don't have to say, well, to believe the Bible, I have to reject science. I don't think we have to reject science. And I think, you know, I don't think scientists are out to fool us or corrupt us, or they're all tools of the devil. And I believe light really does travel at 186,000 miles a second. And so, having that in mind, we start the Bible with two accounts of creation. One of those is in Genesis chapter 1, one of those is in Genesis chapter 2. And because of time, I'm not going to have us literally read all of that. But open your Bible to that first account. And you know that, but we'll just look at one day, because they all follow a pattern, a poetic pattern. It says, in the beginning. This is the beginning. And it says, God made the heavens and the earth. And it describes what the state of the universe was before God spoke. It says, the earth was formless and empty. This is Genesis 1:2. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. For the Old Testament, water equals chaos. Water symbolizes chaos. In those days, if you went out into the open sea, you were taking your life in your hands. To go out into the water, to go out onto even the lake, Sea of Galilee, much less the Mediterranean, to go out on the water in those days, you were facing chaos. You were facing death. So that's picturing chaos. And God now brings order to chaos. You know, and it says that what God does in verse 3, let there be light. And there was light. He saw the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness night, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Now notice the order there. There was evening, and there was morning. Not what we would say in the West, is it? We would say there was morning and then evening. But when does the day begin for a Jew? At sundown. That's right. The new day begins at sundown. So most of us say the day begins at sunrise, and if we get really technical, it begins at midnight, 12:01. for legal purposes. But in the Jewish culture, the day begins at sundown, so evening and morning. And you know this passage. We have the 6 days of creation. Day 1, light. And each one follows the same pattern. God speaks, and it comes into being. Day 1, light. Day 2 is what? What's the second day?
Separated
Land.
The sky. Yeah. Day 1 is light. Day 2 is sky. Day 3 is what you said. What is day 3? Day 3 is land and sea. Okay. Day 3 is land and sea. So we have light, sky, land and sea. Then we come, and what's the next day after that? Well, actually, not only land and sea, on the third day there's more than just land and sea. There's what else?
Plants.
Plants, yeah. Land, sea, vegetation. And that's all on the third day. Then on the fourth day is what?
Sun, moon, stars.
The sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, right off the bat, we think, no, wait a minute. How can you have plants and vegetation without the sun? How can you have plants and vegetation without the sun? Well, yeah, but the thing is, here's what enlightened me when I was in seminary about taking Old Testament, because we were working our way through this and we come up with something like that. No, wait a minute. How can you have land and all this and vegetation and there's no sun or moon or stars? I said, how is that? And then the professor said, well, you know how the rabbi would answer that question? And we was like, yes, how does the rabbi answer that question? He said, the rabbi would say, it doesn't matter to the point of the story. The rabbi's answer is, it doesn't matter to the point of the story. And don't take this as sacrilegious, but the example he used was, when we tell a joke. Now, I'm not saying the Bible is a joke. He's saying, you're telling a joke and you go, 3 guys walked into a bar. And wait a minute, well, where was the bar located? Well, it doesn't matter. So 3 guys walk into a bar. Well, how old were the guys? Well, it doesn't matter. I'm trying to tell you a joke. 3 guys walk into a bar. Well, was it in Oklahoma or was it in America? I mean, if you go, it doesn't matter. I'm trying to tell you a joke. I'm trying to get to the punchline. I'm trying to tell you something about it. And what the 3 guys were wearing, or how old they were, or their names, or all these other things. Did they drive? Did they walk? Did they ride on a horse to get there? None of those things make any difference. And it's the same way here. Boy, how can the sun can come in on the 4th day? It's a poem. It's a poem about God's creation. That's why it's structured. Everything. There was night and there was day. The first day. There was night and there was day. The second day. There was night and there was day. The third day. And you look at it, it's repetitive. Everything is repeating the same words over and over and over again. Because this is a poetic telling of creation. So you get the 4th day. I need to make sure I don't digress too much, but have you ever seen the movie or the play Inherit the Wind? Which is about the fictionalized version of the Scopes monkey trial that happened back in the 1920s. There's a place where the character who is supposed to be like William Jennings Bryan takes the stand, and the other attorney, who's supposed to be Clarence Darrow, is cross-examining him on his knowledge of the Bible. And he starts asking him questions like that. Now, how could there be vegetation when there's no sun? And things like that. Because the Bryant character is taking the role of the fundamentalist. So, the 4th day is the sun and the moon. Oh, and by the way, the stars, which is billions of galaxies. Remember, the stars get kind of like, oh yeah, and the stars, which we know now, the expanse of the universe is billions of galaxies, each of which contains billions of stars. Then, what's day 5?
Creatures.
Well, not just all the creatures.
In the sea.
Sea and air.
Yeah, birds and in the sea. Birds and in the sea. And then finally on the sixth day, we get
Animal.
land animals and
Man.
humans. Right. We get humans. And it's capped off by verse 27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And he blesses them and he says, multiply, and I'm giving you, kind of putting you in charge of the planet. And it says, that's the end of the sixth day. And then, the end of the 6 days of creation, of course we have this little verse. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. On the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. And he blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Because on it, he rested from the work of creating. Man, now wait a minute. If God is all powerful, why does he need to take a break? You know? Why is God tired? God doesn't get tired. God doesn't get weary. Again, it's because this is a poetic telling of creation. This is a poem about the majesty of creation told. And again, if you said, well, then Rabbi, what's the point? What's the point of this story? The rabbi might say, well, to talk about God's majesty, or to remind us that everything comes into being through the pure word of God. Or the rabbi might say, well, the whole story is there to tell you why we rest on the seventh day. Why do we rest one out of every 7 days? We rest on the seventh day because God did. And then if you get real technical, now wait, well, how did God have to rest? Isn't God all powerful and all, And the rabbi would say, you're missing the point of the story. You're missing the point of the story. And that's what, all through these first 11 chapters, that's going to be the response. Don't try to understand this in terms of science. And that's not a deficiency of the Bible. That's a misunderstanding of what kind of literature we're reading. If you read a poem, and it's talking about, and her tears flowed like a fountain, well now that, I don't think you could have that many tears, you wouldn't say that. You would understand this is a poetic way of talking. And that's what this is. And we know this even more because we have, in chapter 2, we start all over again. We start creation stories all over again. And this is because scholars will tell you these stories are passed along orally, generation after generation after generation after generation, before they're ever written down. These stories of creation are passed along around the campfire and around the family table, generation after generation after generation. And there were 2 different creation stories. The first one is a poem that we just read. The second one reads more like a story, a fable. Okay. And here's how the second story is. It says, well, here's how God made the world. And it says, verse 2:4, when God made the earth and the heavens, there was no shrub or plant, and there wasn't any rain, but he made a man. Verse 7, 2:7, the Lord formed the man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And then just to jump ahead, I'm going to come back to this creation of man, but you look all the way down to chapter 2, verse 19, and what does God start doing? He starts making animals. 2:19, there's just Adam, and God starts making animals. He says it's not good for him to be alone, so he starts forming out of the ground all the beasts of the field, all the birds of the air, and all that. So, Genesis 2, he makes man, and then he makes animals, and then eventually he's going to make a woman. Now, after having just read chapter 1, is there any problem with that? Huh? What was the order of humans and animals in chapter 1? Animals first, then humans.
Yeah.
What's the order here in chapter 2? Man first, then animals, then woman. Okay? And again, this is where if you have somebody who is a fundamentalist who believes we have to read this as science, and you say, well, wait a minute. Which is it? Did God make animals first or humans first? And that's when they kind of start to squirm in their seat. Because the only honest answer is, well, Genesis 1 tells it one way and Genesis 2 tells it a different way. Because one is a poem and one is more of a folk tale, a fable. And they're two different kinds of literature, but they're both literature that is not meant to be taken as science. And that doesn't make it any less true. And that's the thing I had to really understand when I went through school. You say, okay, you can say, okay, is this biography of Abraham Lincoln, is this true? Well, it depends on the slant of the writer, I guess, in a lot of ways, what's his angle. But you can say, well, yes, this is an accurate portrayal of Abraham Lincoln, or it's not. Okay, then I pull out a poem by Robert Frost. Is this true? Is this poem true? Well, not in the same way as the biography of Lincoln, it's not. Pull out a sonnet by Shakespeare. Is this sonnet true? Well, you have a whole different way of judging a sonnet or a poem or a song than you do a biography of a president. I mean, we apply different, and so we say if the point of the song or the poem or the sonnet is a truthful statement about the nature of the human condition or about how people behave one another, or what love is all about, you would say, yes, it's truthful, but not in the same way as a book of history is true. And we have to judge this literature on the kind of story it is. And as we get into this story of the Eden, we realize this is a very different kind of story. So God makes the man, and it says he makes him out of mud, right? But he's just a mud man until God does what? Breathes into him. Now, in Genesis 1, God just said, let there be this and let there be that. And he's like a magician. Poof, poof, poof. But here in 2, God gets his hands dirty. He fashions the man out of mud, but he's still just a mud man until God, breathes into him. And I've said this before in sermons or lessons, but the word there, the word for breath in Hebrew, let me say this word, is ruach. Okay. Let me get a better mark. Let's see if this is any better. The word in Hebrew, I'm not going to write it with the Hebrew characters because but it's pronounced ruach, or ruach, you got it, ruach, okay, in the Hebrew. The word in Hebrew, ruach, means breath, but it also means wind, but it also means spirit. The same Hebrew word, it can be translated any of those 3 ways. So God breathed into the man. He blew his wind into the man. He put his spirit into the man. And that's the way Hebrew works. And you won't remember, maybe you'll remember this many moons from now when we get the New Testament. But in the New Testament, there's another word, pneuma, like the word pneumonia, pneumatic, all those words. Great. And guess what? It means all those 3 things also. Pneuma in Greek also means breath or wind or spirit. So ruach in Hebrew and pneuma in Greek all can be translated any of those 3 words. The breath, wind, or spirit. So when the symbolism of God breathing into this man is not just oxygen. The word has all these colors to it. So he breathes into the man becomes a living being, and he says, then it talks about, the geography of the garden, and he puts him in this garden called Eden, and he gives him a command that's going to come back to bite him here. 2:15, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden. You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When you eat of it, you'll die. then he says, you know, it's not good to have just one creature, because, you know, I've made a living being here, but he's going to be lonely, so I'm going to make something to be his companion. So he makes an antelope and a frog and a, you know, mongoose and a duck and all these other things. And it says he brings every animal he makes to the man, and the man says, I'm going to call that a duck. I'm going to call that a mongoose or whatever, and that's its name. But it says, but none of those are a suitable companion for the man. That's not going to do it for him. So, we finally learn the man's name, which is what? Adam. You know, and we all know people named Adam, don't we? You know? Adam's a relatively still popular name. We know at least a few people named Adam. In Hebrew, it's pronounced Adam. But guess what? In Hebrew, it's not a proper name. It was not a proper name. The word Adam in Hebrew means humanity. So the word Adam translates as humanity. Now again, if you're reading this in Hebrew, or let's say you're reading it in English, and then humanity said blah, 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 you would go, wait a minute, this is a different kind of story. This person is named humanity, not Fred or Joe or Bill or Ted. So Adam is the Hebrew word for humanity. Now, you know, not to sound pretentious, but this is the kind of thing a person who's a fundamentalist just doesn't get. You know, I had a fundamentalist young man who I'm sure was sincere, who argued with me that the King James translation was more reliable than the Greek or the Hebrew. He had been taught in his church that the King James translation of the Bible was more inspired than the original Greek or Hebrew. And that his church, that's the only translation of the Bible that they would ever use. And there are churches out there still today that they will only use the King James translation of the Bible, because they believe that it was uniquely inspired above any other translation, and apparently for this young man, even more so than the original languages. And in the fundamentalist churches, they don't study what it means in the original language. They don't really study the historical part of it. And if you say, well, you know, Adam is not a proper name in that day. It means humanity. They would be surprised and probably worried and then defensive. So Adam, humanity, doesn't have a proper mate, and so God performs surgery and puts Adam under. You know, he puts him to sleep. Which, by the way, you know that back when they first invented anesthesia, there were some people who were against it, and they argued, well, God was the first one to use anesthesia right here. So he puts Adam to sleep, takes out a rib, and makes the woman, instead of making her out of mud, makes her out of a rib, and then it brings her to Adam, brings her to humanity, and she says, and he says when he sees Eve, which, by the way, you know what, Eve is also not a proper name. Eve means life giver. Life giver. Life giver. Life giver is what Eve means. Life giver. So God brings life giver to humanity, and humanity says, wow, now this is what I've been waiting for. You know, this is a lot better than the groundhog. You know, and he says, you know, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. She was taken from the womb of man. She is a womb man. Now that's, of course, in the English. In the Hebrew, she shall be called Isha because she came from Ish. Ish and Isha is male and female in Hebrew. He brings her, and he says, she shall be called Isha because she came from Ish. But in the English, we're a little, we're clever and say woman out of man. And they become a couple, and then it says, it's like, in case you didn't get, here's the point of the story. The point of the story is not, here's how human beings came onto planet Earth. He says, and here's the reason for the story. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they'll become one flesh. In other words, around the family circle, why do people get married? Why are there two sexes? Well, let me tell you the story. God decided to make a person. And he made him out of mud. And this story is the answer to the question, why are there two sexes and why do people get married? And of course this verse about a man shall leave his father and mother and be united, I read that verse every time I do a wedding. Because this idea of marriage is an invention of God. So you might say, what's the point of the first story? Why do we rest 1 out of 7 days? What's the point of the second story? Why do people get married? There's the reasons for the story, at least from the rabbi's perspective, are not about a scientific explanation of the origins of the species. We don't have to choose between science and faith if we understand what kind of literature the Bible is offering to us, especially in these first 11 chapters of Genesis. Now, you'd say, well, that's great. Could we end the story right there? No, it's not. It's going to turn south now. Because remember, there's this tree. And, oh, by the way, it mentions in verse 25, the man and the woman are both what? Naked. They're both naked. Yeah, they're both naked. And they felt no embarrassment. They felt no shame. Okay. Who do we know, in our experience, within the family, who runs around naked and doesn't care and have any problem with it? Children. Huh? Children. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, the dog too. Yeah, but yeah, a toddler, a preschooler, up until, I can't remember when, for too long now, since ours were that young, but, at what point kids have no modesty, they run out of the tub, so think about that. Who are those who have no concern for being naked? It's the innocent, it's children. Okay? Children don't know they're naked. Okay? The concept of naked is not something that children are even thinking about. Okay? So keep that in mind. We get to chapter 3. And now we have a third character enter the story, which is who?
Serpent.
A serpent. And the serpent can talk. The serpent can talk. And the serpent goes up to the woman and says, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? Now, okay, we've had a couple of clues as to how to read this story. Clue 1, the man is named mankind, or humanity. Clue 2, the woman is named life-giver. Clue 3, there's talking animals. Okay?
And a snake that can walk and talk.
Yeah. And when you have a story with talking animals, again, what was the rabbi going to tell you? If the story has talking animals, it's a certain kind of story. If you're reading a book and the animals are talking, it's probably not a it's probably not a historical narrative, and then and they were at the Continental Congress in the 1770s, and suddenly a horse said, well, George Washington, I think you ought to do that. If there's talking animals in the story, it's probably not a scientific story. It's probably not meant to be taken as a scientific story. It's a certain kind of story. So they have talking animals here. But yeah, and a snake who has legs, too, at this point. The serpent in this story still has his legs. The serpent says, did God really say you can't eat any of the fruit? Is that what God said? No, God didn't say that. He's baiting them. You know, and this is where the trouble starts, because the snake is representing temptation. And Eve, the woman, says, "Oh no, God didn't say that. He just said we can't eat from that one tree. We can't eat that, and we can't even touch it, or we'll die." Did God say that? No, God didn't say that either. He didn't say anything about touching it. He just said don't eat it. So Eve adds to God's commandment. She makes God's rule harsher than God. Which is sometimes something we also do. She said, "Oh, God said we can't eat it and we can't even touch it," which God didn't say. And then the serpent said, she says, "If we touch it, we'll die." And the serpent says, "Oh, you're not going to die, because God knows that if you eat it, you'll be a god. You'll be equal to God. You'll decide what's good and evil. You'll decide what's right and wrong. If you eat the fruit, your eyes will be open and you'll be like a god." And that's when she eats it, and also, and she gave some to Adam, and he eats it too. And you always wonder, well, was he standing there during this conversation, or did she just go over and say, "Here, eat this," or was he? Okay. Now, if we're thinking about this, again, we're thinking about this as a story that's about. This is a story about who is God and who are we. Given everything up to this point, what does this story say about humanity?
They make up their own understanding and belief.
Yeah?
Free will.
Yeah? Free will?
That's free will part.
Mm-hmm. What does Eve want to do? What does she want to be?
She wants to be like God.
She wants to be like God. She wants to be the one making the rules. She wants to be. Now, sometimes we're like, well, wait, but the tree is called knowledge of good and evil. But you think of it, if Adam and Eve are symbolized that they're naked, which means they're like children, all they know is obey or disobey. Children are not saying, "Well, is this a moral thing for me to write on the wall with this crayon?" What are the moral implications of me using this crayon on the wall? Would that be justified? No. Children know, I've been told, don't do it. Right? It's obey or don't obey. So Adam and Eve are children, and their Creator has said, you can do any of these, you can eat any of this stuff. Eat anything you want. Just that one thing you can't do. But that's the one thing now that the serpent whispers, "Oh, it'll be so tasty, and then you'll be like God." And she eats it, and he eats it, and notice it nowhere says what kind of fruit it is. Nowhere does it mention apple, although we somehow got that into our. Their eyes are open, they realize they're naked, and they cover themselves. Now, this is not about we need to be ashamed of our bodies and there's something bad about our body. What does this symbolize?
It shows they disobeyed.
Huh?
It shows they disobeyed.
Yeah. There's a loss of innocence. They're feeling now, oh no, I'm guilty. I've been exposed. Exposed not so much in the literal nakedness, but my sin is done. And so they cover themselves up, and they hear God coming towards them. Because realize, in Genesis 1, God is almost like, a magician just saying, "Let it be so, let it be so, let it be so." But in chapter 2, God is right down there in the mud and in the dirt. And so they hear God footsteps approaching. God is walking towards them. And, we don't know how long from the creation to the tree. Is it a day? Is it a week? Is it a month? Is it 50 years? How long from the time, because the story doesn't tell us, so it doesn't matter. But we're to understand, normally, before this moment, if they heard God coming, they'd be excited, like, yay, God's coming, we get to spend time with God. Just like the child, Daddy's home, yay, Daddy's home. But if the child has been disobedient, Daddy's home.
He's gonna fix it.
Yeah. The reaction to Daddy's coming or Daddy's home depends on the child's mindset. So in this case, God is coming does not elicit, oh boy, it's oh no. So they hide. And God says, where are you? And Adam says, well, I heard you in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked and I hid. And God's response is so fascinating. Who told you that you were naked? A child. Who told you? Did you eat the fruit? And what does the man say? She did! Her fault! It was the woman. Not just that. Look at what he literally says. Verse 12, 3:12. The woman that you put here, she gave it to me. So he not only blames the woman, he blames God. That woman that you put here, it's her fault. Now what does the woman say? It was the serpent. He tricked me. And the serpent at this point doesn't speak. But God says, I'll tell you what, you're going to crawl on your belly. You're losing the legs. And there's always going to be hatred between you and the woman. Between women and snakes. And it's the end of paradise. He says to the woman, guess what? It's going to hurt when you have babies. Childbearing will be painful. And he says to the man, work is going to be hard. It's going to be sweaty work. And when you're growing stuff, there's going to be weeds and thorns and thistles. And so the upshot of this is snakes lose their legs, women are going to have pain in childbirth, and men are going to have to sweat and work hard for a living. And it says humanity named his wife Life Giver because she would be the mother of all living. And so God makes them some clothes and banishes them from the garden, and they are thrown out of paradise. Now, so at the end of chapter 3, and don't worry, I'm going to go a little faster than I here, but at the end of chapter 3, end of chapter 3 is paradise, Eden. At the end of chapter 3, there's a fall. This is usually referred to as the fall of humanity, the fall. So here we go. The fall happens in Genesis chapter 3. How long is it going to take us to get back to paradise? 66 books. Take us all the way to Revelation to get back to paradise. You take the entire Bible to get from paradise lost to paradise regained. It's going to take the entire Bible to get from what is lost in Eden to what is described in the last 2 to 3 chapters of the book of Revelation, the New Jerusalem. What Jesus talked about, the Father's house. It's going to take the entire Scriptures to get from here to here. And that is one of the threads. There's threads that go all the way through the Bible. And maybe they don't turn up in every single book, but this thread of paradise lost and then paradise gained, the thread of sin. And, sin is, there's a capital S sin here, there are sins, we can list sins, stealing and lying and killing, and there are sins. But then there's capital S sin, which, to tell you, some of you remember Brian Mangan, who was our associate, 3 associates back now, before James, before James before Desi, and Desi was before. Brian was preaching on the difference between sin with a capital S and sins, and Brian said in the sermon, he told this story on himself. He said, "I'm talking about big S sin." And not everybody heard exactly the, if you don't say that very clearly, big S sin. Enunciate really carefully if you're going to say that. But, sin with a capital S is this condition of humanity. And if you say, what is the, when humanity, when Adam and Eve, when they decide to eat the fruit, what is the root of that sin? Disobedience. And what maybe even, what is their motivation?
They want to be like God.
They want to be like God.
She does.
Which is pride. Pride. Because pride, we're going to see pride is really at the root of all sin. Pride is the foundation really of all sin. Because sin is always about, I want it my way, I want what I want to be, I want to be in charge, I want to do things my way, I want everybody to do what I want, I want to be, pride is really the foundation of any other kind of sin. If you think about it, why do people do all kinds of sins? It somehow boils back to pride. And we're going to see that as a thread, how pride is there. And remember, pride in the negative sense. Not like I'm proud of my kids or I'm proud of my country, or not that kind of pride. This sense of I want what I want my way, which is why when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we pray, "Thy will be done." But often what we really want is, "My will be done." A lot of it. In our heart of hearts, when we pray, "Thy will be done," do we mean it, or do we really say, "Lord, my will be done. I want it my way"? Frank Sinatra did it his way. Now, Cain and Abel, and I'm not, story. They have 2 sons. We don't hear about their childhood. They grow up. Cain becomes a farmer, and Abel becomes a rancher, and they both bring offerings to God, and God likes Abel's offering and doesn't care much for Cain's, and we're not given a real explicit reason, although if you read it, it says Abel brought the best that he could bring, and it says, and Cain brought some fruit, brought some vegetables. It's kind of like, you could idea maybe Cain was not particularly picky about what he brought to God for an offering. But Cain gets very jealous, and God says, "Watch out, Cain." And he takes his brother out in the field, and we know what happens. He kills Abel. The first murder, fratricide, brother killing brother, and God says to Cain, "Where's your brother?" And then this infamous quote, "Am I my brother's keeper?" What's the answer to that?
Yes.
Yes, you are. Yeah. Cain throws it out rhetorically, like, I have no responsibility for any other human being. It's all about me. God says, "Where's your brother? Am I my brother's keeper? Am I?" Ultimately, we are our brother and sister's keeper. We do have responsibility for each other. But because of this, Cain is cast out from the family. And here's the part that, again, if you've ever seen the play or seen the movie Inherit the Wind, this is one of the parts of the cross-examination, where Clarence Darrow character says, it says here in Genesis 4:16, Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant, and she gave birth to Enoch. And he said, now wait a minute. He said, now, where did she come from? Where did Cain's wife come from? Because he's banished from the family. He goes in the land of Nod. Notice he goes to the land of Nod. You know what the word Nod means? Wandering. Wandering. Land of Nod. So he banishes Cain to the land of wandering. He banishes Cain to the land of wandering. Again, what kind of story are we reading here? This is not, you don't look on a map. Where's the land of wandering? And it says, so he goes far away from Adam and Eve and everybody else. Oh, and then he gets married and he marries his wife and they have kids and then they have kids. And you're like, oh, Rabbi, where'd Cain's wife come from? It's not important to the point of the story, says the rabbi. It doesn't matter to the point of the story. Now, fundamentalists who want to take this stuff as science, they have to do all kinds of gymnastics to come up with an answer to that question. And you have to introduce incest and all kinds of other things to even come up with, so things that are expressly forbidden, like incest, is the only way that you would have Cain. If you say, well, he married one of his sisters, well, that's forbidden in the Bible. Well, this was a special case. I mean, no. No, the answer that the rabbi would give, which is really the answer when we understand what kind of literature we're reading, the answer is, it doesn't matter to the point of the story. The point of the story is what? Am I my brother's keeper? And the answer is yes. Yes, we are. That's the point of the story. So, then we have some genealogy that's not as interesting. I'm going to jump to later on. Things get kind of worse within a few generations. Like this fellow Lamech in 425 says, Ada and Zillah, listen to me. This is this fellow Lamech talking to his wives. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain has avenged 7 times, Lamech has been Lamech 77 times. So it's like things are getting worse. And then we're kind of introduced to a new line of people. We're introduced to this. We're introduced to Adam and his sons, and we go through the genealogy of chapter 5. And some of these people live to be incredibly old people. And again, fundamentalists take these numbers literally, especially Methuselah, who apparently lived to be 969. Again, you might call this sort of divine exaggeration. I mean, he was really, really old, but if somebody was literally hundreds of years old, I don't think it's something we necessarily have to take as literally. So, we go through all these genealogies in chapter 5, and then finally in chapter 6 we're told, well, this whole long lifespan thing is going to get shortened up. We're given a very mysterious thing that I don't have to go into about the Nephilim, which is the children of the sons of God and the daughters of men, which almost sounds like angels are marrying humans, and that's only mentioned in one verse, and it's just kind of, well, just pass on by that. We don't, Yeah, and they say these are some of the mighty men of old, But here's the passage that leads us into the flood story. And I think if you say, what's the most what's one of the most depressing and tragic passages in all the Bible? It has to be here in Genesis 6, verse 5. Genesis 6, 5. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. And the Lord said, I'll wipe mankind whom I've created from the face of the earth, men and animals, creatures who move along the ground, birds of the air, for I'm grieved that I've made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now, again, I think the Noah story also falls in line with an epic story that is more of a parable than history. Some people have tried to search for Noah's Ark or try to calculate how much water it would take to cover the entire planet, or things like, well, how did the kangaroos and the panda bears and all these creatures from different places possibly make it onto the ark? And again, I don't think the Noah story is meant to be, again, a literal historical story. I think it's meant to be a parable with a point. And we know that other cultures do have similar stories about wiping the earth clean. And again, I would tend to think we would not take this story as literal scientific history. But again, what's the point? The point is how the human heart had just become wicked, evil. How evil, starting with Cain and this first murder, well, really starting with the forbidden fruit, but especially with Cain, it's like things get worse and worse and worse and worse until it says God was sorry he even made people, which is a heartbreaking statement. But in the midst of this heartbreaking statement, there is always grace and redemption and salvation. And there is a righteous man, Noah. And God says, well, we're going to start over. And you know the story. He tells Noah to build this huge boat. And there's a place now they can build a replica of it somewhere. Is it in Branson where they have the replica? Tennessee. That's life size, or to scale, at least to the biblical scale of it. By the way, they made that Noah movie a few years back with Russell Crowe. It was terrible. It was just terrible. It was not good at all. I like Russell Crowe sometimes, but Gladiator I like, but I didn't like that movie. And this idea of two by two of the unclean animals and 7 pairs of the clean animals. You notice that? You kind of missed that detail. The unclean animals, the animals you couldn't eat, 1 pair. The animals you could eat, 7 pairs, are brought on to the ark. And I always think it's interesting when we talk about the Noah story is that, is there any story that is more sort of put in children's books and put on little kid posters than the Noah Ark story, the happy little animals on the ark, on the boat with Noah? This is not a happy story. This is about drowning humanity. This is about drowning everybody except for one family. It is not a happy story. It is a story of how heartbroken God is over the evil and sin of humanity. Now again, I don't take it literally, but it's a story that's trying to tell us about how the descent of humanity into evil is finally going to get, we'll see next week. The story of sin is going to be, what's the solution to this? Well, the solution to this is going to be Abraham. We're building up this idea of the whole earth getting worse and worse and worse. And it's building up to the idea of, then there was this fellow, Abraham. And when we get to Abraham, we go from fable to history of a family in a place at a time with we go from these stories that kind of take place once upon a time to an actual person who lived in an actual place. I mean, we go into, because chapter 12 is a whole different kind of literature than chapters 1 through 11. So we've got this Noah story, and notice that there's the flood, and there's horrible death, but then the waters recede, and there's the rainbow. And verse 9:12, the rainbow is in the sky, which is a sign of God's promise, God's covenant, that this is never going to happen again. The rainbow is a sign that never again will the earth be totally wiped out like this, flooded like this. And the rainbow, it's interesting how the rainbow has gone through lots of different, what it symbolizes to who and when and how and where, but biblically the rainbow symbolizes God's covenant. But Noah, who is the best guy in the world, right? Noah's like the best man on planet Earth. So they finish, they get off the boat. He's got his 3 sons and their wives. So there's Noah, his unnamed wife. We don't know his wife's name. Mrs. Noah, the 3 sons and their wives. So we've got 8 people coming out of the ark. And notice what is the very first thing Noah does after the flood?
It's drunk.
Gets drunk. Yeah. Well, it takes him a while. It says he gets out.
That's the part that's not a parable.
I mean, they kind of telescope. He gets out of the boat, he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk. I mean, there's a little time, you got to plant the grapes. I mean, you got to ferment. I mean, but it just says in verse 9:20, Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside of his tent. So he gets drunk and naked. Okay? And this is the best guy in the world. Okay? This is of all the people on planet Earth, this is the best guy. And the first thing he does after getting off the boat is get drunk and get naked. And it says, Ham, remember there's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham, who we are told, by the way, the father of who?
Canaan.
As in who?
Canaanite.
As in Canaanites. Yeah, the Canaanites. We're not a fan of the Canaanites. Canaanites are going to end up being the enemies of the children of Abraham. Ham is the father of Canaan, as in Canaanite. Ham, we're told, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his 2 brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backwards and covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way so they would not see their father's nakedness. You can picture this, the 2 of them, they get a blanket like this. Throw the blanket this way so they don't see their dad naked. Because this was a sign, you don't look upon your father's nakedness. This is a sign of disrespect. This is a sign of something that you didn't do. It was considered a taboo to look at your father's naked. And we might say, well, it's Noah's fault. He's the one who got drunk. But that's not in the Hebrew culture. That doesn't matter. And why is Ham in trouble?
Well, he didn't quite cover his father.
Yeah,
He just went out and told
he just went out.
boys.
Yeah, he went in there. He saw his father naked, and he didn't cover him up. And he said, "Hey guys, Dad's naked in there." And told his brothers. So Ham is put now in a bad light. Verse 24. Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him. In other words, look upon him naked. And he said, "Cursed be Ham." No, that's not what he says, is it? Cursed be Canaan, the grandson who's not even born yet. Which tells you that by the time this story is written down, this story has been told until by the time it's written down, the Israelites are in conflict with the Canaanites. By the time this story is written down, the Israelites are warring with the Canaanites. So this story, in its form here, is not written down until at least the time of Joshua. So remember, these stories are orally told and retold and retold and retold for generation after generation after generation until they're finally written down. And who wrote them down? We don't know. Now, again, traditionally, they're called the 5 books of Moses. But even really the most conservative of scholars would not try to claim that Moses wrote these books. For one, we get to Deuteronomy, and it records Moses' death, which would be pretty hard for Moses to write, record his own death. So who wrote these books, we really don't know. But who wrote them is maybe not as important as the fact these stories are ancient stories, passed down for hundreds of years before they find their written form. So by the time they're written down, the Canaanites are a problem. And so here, it's not Ham who's in trouble, it's his son, Canaan. He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave." Now, there have been all kinds of...
And he's talking about his unborn grandson.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
But remember, this story is not scientific, historically, the kind of story. It's a story about, that often, I mean, it'd be like, I'm trying to think, if we were talking about a historical story and, we said something about, John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, and we said, who was the father of this person in the 20th century?
Yeah.
We're writing down from the, we're writing about history, but now we're inserting the fact. And I say that because the girl I dated in college, which thank God I didn't marry. She was a wonderful person, but not the right person for me. But she was a direct descendant of John Adams, President Adams. And her family was very proud of the fact that they were descended from President Adams. So if I was writing about John Adams, our second president, ancestor of the girl I dated in college, that would be me inserting that into a narrative about something that happened long ago.
When did people start dying younger than 950?
Well, I think as long as there have been people. I think that is an exaggeration. I don't think people ever lived to be 969. If anything, I think lifespan has continually gotten longer and longer and longer since. I think when they said Methuselah lived to be 969 years old, again, I don't think that's a historical story. I think that's about these men of old, these mythical men of old. They lived to be hundreds of years old, and they were. And again, the fundamentalists will try to say, well, before the flood, I've heard all kinds of crazy, I shouldn't say crazy, but interesting ideas about, well, before the flood, the sun and the atmosphere allowed people to live hundreds of years older, and there's no science to support any of that people ever lived to be 1,000 years old. I think that's, again, something we're not meant to take literally. So I think, I know the average circuit rider in the 1700s didn't even live to 40. Died in his 30s. You know, if you look at the lifespan, the average lifespan, even a couple hundred years ago, it's staggering. I mean, the average lifespan just a couple hundred years ago was like 50. You know, people died a lot younger. So, chapter 10 is one of those, as we said, one of those begat chapters. You know, back in the King James, so-and-so begat this guy, and he begat this guy, and he was the son of this one. All the, but again, you know, and we read all that, and these names are pretty meaningless to us. But to the person living in Joshua's time, or living during the wars with the Canaanites, you know, where all these people came from was significant. And, you know, there have been all kinds of crazy ways of spinning this three sons of Noah thing. There have been people who've tried to say, with zero biblical or scientific background, that the three sons were the three, quote, races, you know, white, black, and Asian, that these were somehow the predecessors of the three races of humanity, and they tried to justify slavery by saying that black people were descendants of Ham, and that this was somehow biblical justification for slavery, which, you know, there's no scientific or biblical background for that.
There were slaves of every color.
Well, of course, but I'm saying if you're a racist and a slave owner, you're going to try to find any justification you got, and you know, even if you're twisting everything to try to arrive at it. I mean, as I've said before, and I'll say this multiple times, you know, people will find ways to twist the Bible to justify some of the most unjustifiable things you can. And you know, the more you read the Bible in context, the more you realize some of the ways that people try to take verses out of context, or try to find a verse to support some action that is really indefensible, that you can pluck a verse out of the Bible, and if you find a way that it's, you know, you can, there's one of those terms that you learn in seminary, there's a term called exegesis. You don't need to remember that, but exegesis is pulling the meaning out of the Scripture. Exegesis means pulling the meaning out of the Bible. But the opposite is eisegesis. Eisegesis is, this is what I already believe and want to say. Now let me see if I can find a verse to back me up. You know, I've already decided what I think and what I want and all this. Now let me find another way to call it proof texting, or a different. Let me find a verse that I can yank out of context to support this very non-biblical idea. You know, and that's what the prosperity preachers do. You know, the TV evangelists who say that if you just have enough faith, you're going to drive a Rolls Royce and live in a mansion and all this other things if you send them your money. But last story is the Tower of Babel, which we'll just take 5 minutes with. And the Tower of Babel is not nearly as well known as the Eden stories and the Noah stories and the creation stories. But again, it says, and again, we're still talking about linguists would not say this is historical fact. Because it says there was a time in which everybody in the world spoke all the same language. And, they said basically, let's build a tower to heaven. Let's build a tower to heaven and make a name for ourselves. Okay, what does that also smack of? Yeah. Let's make a tower to reach all the way to heaven and make a name for ourselves. And, think about the ridiculousness of that idea. I mean, and so they start doing it, but in the story, God says, these people, they're all bent on doing this, and let's see what happens when they don't all speak the same language. And they start, they're building, and You know, the guy like, hey, hand me that Framistan. What? The Gibblebot, the Gooby G. Like, what? You know, I mean, yeah, you know, and then suddenly none of them they don't understand each other. And the building project stops, and they named the place where they had started this project. They named the place Babel. Now, we talk about somebody babbling on, yeah.
Well, the Lord says, "And let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." What us is he talking about?
Yeah, there's a few times in the Bible where God uses this us language. Probably we're talking about the heavenly host, you know, the angelic host. Some people said, oh, you know, we're talking about, you know, God is triune, Father, Son, and Spirit. But of course, that idea of Trinity is not really pronounced in the Old Testament. Probably the us is more about seeing God as king, and God is surrounded by the angels and etc. And so let's us go do this more in an angelic way. Is probably the best answer to that question. But notice they call the place Babel, which we use the term, right? We use the term. Somebody was just babbling on, you know, or a babbling brook. But Babel also is like what other place?
Babylon.
Babylon.
So I heard an ad for a program where you can easily learn other languages.
Uh-huh.
And it's BABEL.
Yeah.
So I wondered when I heard the ad if it was referring to.
I'm sure it's a play on this. Yeah, Babel. But yeah, it's like, yeah, you know what? Listen to this tape at night, and you'll wake up speaking French. Mon Dieu. I mean, language does not come naturally to me. I mean, I studied French, Greek, and Hebrew, and all three were a struggle. I don't think you can learn a language easily. Some people learn language more easily than others. Janine, she learned quite a bit of Polish before we went to Poland. She was getting pretty good. She did that, what's it called, the Rosetta Stone? Yeah, the Rosetta Stone thing. I started it, but I was like, I can't learn any more languages. I got the French and the Greek and the Hebrew are up there. I can't squeeze anything else in there. I can't squeeze Polish in too. So Babylon, and if we were looking on the map today to point to Babylon, where would we be pointing? Iraq. Iraq is Babylon. The Canaanites, of course, are going to be an enemy of the Israelites, and eventually, of course, the Babylonians are also going to be an enemy of the Israelites. And I always think, one thing about studying the Bible is that these names that sound like almost, you know, mythical names. I mean, these are all real places. I mean, not the land of Nod, the land of wandering, but once we get into, you know, especially chapter 12, all these places are real places. Babylon is Iraq. Persia is Iran. Having now been to the Holy Land a couple of times, you know, these places are actual real places. They're not just a name. These are real places that are still there today. And we'll see biblical names that you'll go, that was in the news. Gaza, or, you know, wherever else. So, well, it is straight up 8 o'clock, and we just about got through 11 chapters. So, we will, and you know, the one thing, if for some reason, if you have to miss a week, I mean, we'll miss you, but the way this is set up, if you miss a week, you know, you can still jump in because we'll be kind of starting, in some ways, fresh every session because we'll be tackling a new book. Now, there are threads and that go all the way from Genesis to Revelation, but don't feel like, well, I missed a week, I guess I'm lost. You won't be lost. If you have to be gone a week, it's fine to jump back in, okay? But you won't be lost. Each week will kind of be, in a way, self-contained, although there'll be, let's say, threads that'll kind of continue, but it won't be like, you won't be lost if you miss a week. So don't feel like you will. All right. Well, let me pray. Lord, once again, thankful for this precious book that teaches us about who you are and who we are, and that we're made for you, by you, in your image. Lord, help us to understand more deeply this amazing book and that was brought to us through so many miracles and hands of so many and traditions and passed along through centuries so that we would have it today. It is truly miraculous to have this book, Lord. And we ask that you help us always to learn more of it and know it deeper and let it speak to our hearts and lives ever better. Amen.